The most dangerous lies are not the ones people tell you. They are the ones people think you will never hear. My name is Ryan Carter, and the sentence that destroyed my marriage was not spoken during an argument. It was not written in a text message. It was not discovered through some dramatic confrontation. It came from the other side of a half-closed door on an ordinary Thursday evening. At the time, I was 41 years old and living what most people would have called a good life. Melissa and I had been married for 7 years. We owned a comfortable home in a quiet suburb outside Denver. We both had stable careers. We hosted holiday dinners, attended neighborhood gatherings, and smiled for photographs that looked exactly the way successful marriages are supposed to look. If you had asked me then whether my wife loved me, I would have said yes without hesitation. Looking back now, I realize I was answering a question I wanted to believe rather than one I had actually examined. That evening started like hundreds before it. I left work around 5:30, stopped at a grocery store to pick up a few things Melissa had texted me about, and drove home through rush hour traffic. The sun was beginning to set behind the mountains, painting the sky with shades of orange and gold. Nothing felt unusual. Nothing warned me that my entire understanding of my marriage was about to change. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed another car parked along the curb. Melissa's friend Jessica was visiting. That was not uncommon. The two of them had known each other since college and met regularly to catch up. I grabbed the grocery bags from the truck and walked toward the front door. As soon as I stepped inside, I heard voices coming from the kitchen. They sounded relaxed, comfortable, the kind of conversation people have when they think nobody else is listening. I was about to announce that I was home when I heard a name. Mark. I stopped. The name meant nothing to me at first. Then Jessica laughed softly and said something I could not quite make out. Melissa answered immediately. Her tone carried a warmth I had not heard in a long time. You know, I never stopped thinking about him, she said. I stood motionless near the hallway. The grocery bags suddenly felt heavier in my hands. Jessica asked another question. Again, I could not hear every word. Then came the sentence that divided my life into before and after. Melissa laughed quietly and said, Ryan is just a substitute. Once Mark is back, I will dump him. For a moment, I genuinely thought I had misunderstood. My brain searched desperately for another explanation, another meaning, another context, anything, but there was none. The words were clear, simple, direct. I felt something strange happen inside me. Not anger, not yet. It was more like the sensation of standing on solid ground and suddenly discovering it was not solid at all. The entire foundation beneath me shifted. Jessica laughed again. You cannot be serious. Melissa answered without hesitation. I am completely serious. Then she said something that hurt even more. Mark was always the one I wanted. Timing just got in the way. I stared at the wall across from me. 7 years. 7 years of birthdays, vacations, mortgage payments, anniversaries, conversations about the future. 7 years of believing I was building a life with someone who had chosen me. And now, in less than 30 seconds, I was hearing that I had never really been the choice at all. I had been the backup plan, the safe option, the placeholder occupying space until someone else returned. My first instinct was to walk into the kitchen and demand an explanation. Most people probably would have. But something stopped me. Maybe it was shock. Maybe it was survival. Whatever it was, I quietly set the grocery bags down near the hallway table and listened. The conversation continued. Mark had apparently moved back to Colorado after years away. Melissa had learned about it recently. She sounded excited, hopeful, like someone waiting for an opportunity she thought had finally arrived. Every word added another piece to a picture I never knew existed. After several minutes, I quietly stepped back outside, closed the front door without making a sound, and walked to my truck. I sat behind the steering wheel staring through the windshield as daylight faded. The neighborhood looked exactly the same as it had 20 minutes earlier. Children rode bicycles down the street. Sprinklers watered front lawns. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Everything appeared normal. Yet nothing was normal anymore. Because for the first time since I met Melissa, I was forced to ask a question I never imagined asking. If I was only a substitute, then who had I really been married to all these years? And I wish that had been the worst part. The next morning, Melissa smiled at me across the breakfast table exactly the way she always had. Sunlight poured through the kitchen windows, reflecting off the granite countertops and filling the room with a warm glow. Fresh coffee filled the air. A plate of toast sat between us. To anyone looking in from the outside, we would have appeared completely normal. A married couple starting another ordinary Friday. That was the strangest part. The world had changed overnight, but nothing looked different. Melissa stirred cream into her coffee and asked whether I had a busy day ahead. Her voice sounded light and casual, familiar. For a second, I caught myself studying her face, searching for some sign of guilt, some sign that she knew what I had heard. There was nothing. She looked perfectly comfortable, perfectly relaxed. A few meetings, I replied. Nothing unusual. She nodded and smiled. That is good. Then she reached for her phone. The movement was small, almost automatic. Yet for the first time, I paid attention. Her eyes dropped to the screen. A notification appeared. A message. The corner of her mouth lifted slightly before she locked the phone and set it face down on the table. It lasted less than 2 seconds. Before that morning, I never would have noticed. Now I noticed everything. That is what betrayal does. It turns ordinary details into evidence. It transforms routine moments into questions. Melissa stood and walked over to the sink. Jessica says hello, by the way. I nearly laughed at the irony. Instead, I took a sip of coffee and nodded. That was nice of her. Melissa glanced back at me. You got home late last night. My heart skipped once. Traffic was terrible. She accepted the answer immediately. No suspicion. No concern. Nothing. She believed I knew nothing. And for reasons I could not fully explain yet, I decided to keep it that way. After she left for work, I remained at the table for nearly 20 minutes. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. 7 years. 7 years of memories suddenly felt different. Not false exactly. Just incomplete. Like a photograph missing half the image. I found myself replaying conversations from the past. Small comments I once ignored. Stories that never quite made sense. Occasions when Melissa seemed distant for reasons she never explained. At the time, I always assumed marriage was complicated. Every relationship has rough seasons. That is what people say. But now another possibility had entered the room. What if the distance had never been about us? What if part of her had always been looking somewhere else? I drove to work and spent the entire morning pretending everything was normal. Thankfully, I had years of practice focusing on business. Numbers behave predictably. Contracts follow rules. Logistics problems have solutions. Human emotions are far more difficult. Around noon, I found myself sitting alone in my office staring at a spreadsheet without actually reading it. My mind kept returning to the same name. Mark. A man I had never met. A man I knew almost nothing about. Yet somehow he occupied space inside my marriage. By late afternoon, curiosity finally overcame me. I opened a search window on my computer and typed his name. Mark Sullivan. The results appeared immediately. Several social media profiles. A few business references. Public records. Nothing extraordinary. Still, I began reading. Piece by piece, a picture emerged. He was roughly my age. He had lived in California for several years. He worked in commercial sales. The details were ordinary, yet the feeling was not. Because every fact I discovered raised a larger question. Why had Melissa never mentioned him? People talk about former relationships all the time. They become stories, memories, chapters that ended. But this felt different. This felt hidden, intentionally hidden. That evening I arrived home before Melissa. The house felt unusually quiet. I walked through the living room and noticed a framed photograph from our wedding sitting on a shelf near the fireplace. We looked happy. Maybe we were. I stared at the image longer than I intended. Then I heard the garage door opening. Melissa was home. Seconds later, she stepped into the kitchen carrying her purse and laptop bag. She smiled the moment she saw me. Hey, she said warmly. How was your day? I looked at her for a moment. The woman in front of me looked exactly like the woman I married. Same voice. Same smile. Same familiar presence. Yet now there was something else standing beside her. A secret. A hidden truth I could no longer ignore. It was productive, I said. How about yours? She smiled again. Pretty good, actually. Then her phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen. And for the second time in 24 hours, I saw that same smile appear before she tried to hide it. For the next 2 weeks, I became a student of my own marriage. Not in an obsessive way. Not in the dramatic way movies portray betrayal. I simply started paying attention. And once I did, I realized how many things I had stopped noticing over the years. Melissa's routines had changed long before that Thursday evening. I just never questioned them because trust has a way of filling in missing pieces. When people believe they are loved, They rarely go looking for cracks in the foundation. Every morning followed the same pattern. We drank coffee together. We talked about work. We discussed grocery lists, bills, weekend plans, and ordinary responsibilities. On the surface, nothing seemed wrong. Yet now I noticed moments that previously passed without meaning. The extra smile when she checked her phone. The way she occasionally drifted away during conversations. The sudden bursts of energy whenever certain notifications appeared. None of it proved anything, but all of it raised questions. One Saturday afternoon, I found myself cleaning shelves in the home office while Melissa met Jessica for lunch. The room contained years of accumulated paperwork, photo albums, and storage boxes. I was not searching for anything. At least that is what I told myself. Then I came across an old photo album from before our marriage. I sat down in the desk chair and started turning pages. College pictures, family vacations, birthday parties, the usual collection of memories people save. Then I saw him for the first time. Mark. I knew immediately because Melissa had written his name beneath a photograph in faded black ink. He stood beside her at what looked like an outdoor concert. They were younger, smiling, comfortable together. The picture itself was innocent. What caught my attention was not the image. It was the way Melissa looked at him. I had seen that expression before. People cannot fake certain things. Admiration is one of them. I continued turning pages. Mark appeared again. A ski trip, a graduation celebration, a beach vacation somewhere along the California coast. He was everywhere throughout that period of her life. Then suddenly he disappeared. The photographs continued, but he was gone. A few years later, I appeared for the first time. Looking at those pages felt strangely unsettling. Not because Melissa had a past. Everyone has one. It was because I could now see the outline of a story she never told me. That evening, after she returned home, we sat together on the back patio watching the sun disappear behind the mountains. The air carried the smell of freshly cut grass from a nearby yard. Melissa leaned back in her chair and smiled. "Do you remember our first date?" she asked. The question surprised me. "Of course." She laughed softly. "You showed up 15 minutes early. I was trying to make a good impression. You were nervous. I was terrified." For a moment, the conversation felt genuine. Real. That made everything harder. Because despite what I had heard, I still cared about her. Maybe that sounds foolish. But emotions do not disappear the moment someone disappoints you. If they did, heartbreak would not exist. Later that night, after Melissa fell asleep, I sat alone in the living room with my laptop. The house was dark except for a lamp near the fireplace. I typed Mark Sullivan's name again. This time I dug deeper. Professional profiles. Archived. Articles. Public information. Gradually, a timeline emerged. Mark and Melissa had dated for nearly 4 years before he relocated for a career opportunity. Their relationship ended shortly afterward. At least officially. The dates caught my attention. Melissa met me less than a year later. I stared at the screen for several seconds. A thought entered my mind that I immediately wished had not. What if she never moved on? What if she simply moved forward? There is a difference. One involves healing. The other involves waiting. Around midnight, I closed the laptop and walked to the kitchen for a glass of water. The house was silent, peaceful, yet I felt farther from my wife than I ever had before. Back in the bedroom, Melissa slept soundly beside me. I watched the ceiling for nearly an hour before finally closing my eyes. Because the more I learned about the man named Mark, the more I realized something unsettling. He was not just a person from Melissa's past. Somehow, without my knowledge, he had remained part of our present. After that night, I stopped looking for answers and started collecting facts. There is a difference. Answers are emotional. Facts are stubborn. Facts do not care what you hope is true. They simply exist. Over the following month, I noticed patterns that had once blended into the background of daily life. Melissa began mentioning work events more frequently, yet her explanations grew strangely vague whenever I asked simple follow-up questions. She spent more time on her phone than before. Sometimes she smiled at messages. Other times she seemed distracted, as though part of her attention belonged somewhere else. None of it would have concerned me under normal circumstances. The problem was that I no longer lived in normal circumstances. I lived in the shadow of a sentence I could not forget. One evening we attended a neighborhood barbecue hosted by friends a few blocks away. The weather was perfect. Children played in nearby yards. Adults gathered around outdoor tables beneath strings of decorative lights. The atmosphere was relaxed and familiar. Melissa seemed unusually energetic that night. She laughed more, talked more, smiled more. At one point, she stepped away from the group to answer a phone call. I watched her from across the yard. She turned slightly away from everyone else. Her posture changed. Her expression softened. It only lasted a minute, but it was enough to catch my attention. When she returned, I asked who had called. Just someone from work, she replied instantly. The answer came too quickly. Not rehearsed exactly. Automatic. As if she had already anticipated the question. I nodded and let the conversation continue. Later that evening, while driving home beneath a clear Colorado sky, she stared out the passenger window and seemed lost in thought. Everything okay? I asked. She smiled. Of course. Then she changed the subject. That became another pattern. Whenever conversations drifted toward anything personal, she redirected them. Not dramatically, smoothly, skillfully, like someone protecting a room she did not want explored. A week later, I experienced another moment that refused to leave my mind. Melissa had left her tablet charging in the living room before heading out to run errands. I was not snooping. At least that was not my intention. Then a notification appeared on the screen. A calendar reminder. The preview showed only a few words before disappearing. Coffee with M, Thursday. I stared at the message longer than I should have. M could have meant anyone. A coworker, a client, a friend. Yet my stomach tightened immediately. Because once doubt enters a relationship, ordinary things stop feeling ordinary. When Melissa returned home later that afternoon, I casually mentioned the reminder. Who is M? I asked. She hesitated for less than a second. Most people would never have noticed it. I did. Megan from work, she said. Then she walked into the kitchen. The explanation sounded reasonable. Completely reasonable. Yet something felt wrong. Not the answer itself. The hesitation before it. That tiny pause lingered in my thoughts long after the conversation ended. Over time, I started keeping notes. Not because I wanted revenge. Not because I was building a case against her. I needed clarity. Dates. Conversations. Inconsistencies. Small observations. Things that seemed insignificant alone but looked different when placed together. One Saturday morning, while organizing old financial records in the basement, I discovered a storage box filled with items Melissa had never unpacked after we moved into the house. Most of it was harmless. Old journals, ticket stubs, greeting cards. Then I found a small envelope tucked between two photo albums. Inside was a folded note. It was not romantic. It was not dramatic. It contained only a few handwritten lines signed by Mark years before I met her. Yet what caught my attention was not the note itself. It was the fact that she had kept it all these years. Through multiple moves. Through relationships. Through marriage. Through 7 years with me. I sat there staring at the paper while dust floated through sunlight from a basement window. The note represented something larger than nostalgia. It represented unfinished business. Unfinished emotions. Unfinished dreams. That night, Melissa sat beside me on the couch while we watched a movie. Her head rested lightly against my shoulder. To anyone else, we would have looked like a happy couple. Comfortable. Stable. Connected. Yet all I could think about was the growing folder inside my desk drawer. A folder containing nothing explosive. Nothing shocking. Just small pieces of a puzzle that continued forming the same picture. And with every new piece, one truth became harder to ignore. Mark was no longer a ghost from the past. Somehow, quietly and steadily, he was becoming part of our present. Mark returned in early September. I learned about it on a Tuesday evening while standing in my own kitchen. The moment itself was almost laughably ordinary. Melissa was preparing dinner. I was reviewing emails on my laptop. The television played quietly in the background. Then her phone lit up on the counter beside her. Normally, she ignored notifications when we were talking. This time she grabbed the phone almost instantly. The change was subtle, but after months of observation, I noticed everything. Her shoulders straightened. Her eyes widened slightly. A smile appeared before she could stop it. Good news. I asked casually. She looked up so quickly that it almost seemed rehearsed. Just something from work. There was that answer again. Work. The most convenient explanation in the world. I nodded and returned my attention to the laptop. A few seconds later, I heard her typing. Fast. Focused. Excited. Later that night, after she went upstairs, I remained in the living room pretending to watch television. About 20 minutes later, her tablet buzzed on the side table. The screen lit up briefly before going dark again. I did not touch it. I did not need to. The notification preview appeared clearly enough from where I sat. Welcome back. Looking forward to seeing you. The message disappeared before I could read more. But I had already seen enough. Welcome back. 3 simple words. My stomach tightened immediately. The next morning, Melissa woke up earlier than usual. She spent extra time choosing clothes before work. She changed outfits twice. Then she changed them again. When she finally came downstairs, she looked more nervous than I had seen her in years. Big meeting? I asked. She smiled. Something like that. Then she left. The front door closed behind her. I sat alone at the kitchen table and stared into my coffee. Somewhere during the previous few months, the mystery had stopped being whether Mark existed. The mystery had become how deeply he still existed inside my marriage. That answer arrived sooner than I expected. 2 days later, I attended a networking event hosted by a local business association. Hundreds of professionals gathered inside a downtown hotel ballroom. The event itself was unremarkable. Name tags, small talk, business cards, the usual routine. I was speaking with a client near the refreshment table when I heard a familiar name. Mark Sullivan. I turned instinctively. A group of people stood nearby discussing a recent hire at a regional sales firm. One of them pointed toward the opposite side of the room. I followed the gesture. And there he was. For the first time, the ghost had a face. Mark looked exactly like the photographs I had found. A little older. A few more lines around his eyes. Otherwise unchanged. He stood confidently among a small group of people, laughing at something someone had said. I watched him for several seconds, waiting for some dramatic reaction. Anger, jealousy, resentment. Nothing came. What I felt instead was curiosity, because the man standing across the room looked remarkably ordinary. Not extraordinary. Not impressive. Not larger than life. Just a man. The realization surprised me. For months, I had unknowingly built him into something bigger. A rival. A threat. A symbol. Yet standing there in a crowded ballroom, he looked like every other professional in attendance. That was when another thought entered my mind. What if Melissa was not in love with Mark himself? What if she was in love with the version of him she carried in her memory? The difference matters. Real people have flaws. Memories rarely do. Over the next few weeks, more pieces fell into place. Melissa mentioned attending new networking events. She suddenly developed an interest in industry gatherings she had previously avoided. She smiled more often, checked her phone more frequently. Sometimes she seemed almost energized by a future only she could see. And through all of it, she appeared completely certain that I remained unaware. Then one Friday evening, certainty finally cracked. Melissa returned home from work carrying a level of excitement she could barely contain. We sat down for dinner, and before I could ask about her day, she spoke first. You remember that person I told you about from my past? She asked. My heart remained perfectly calm. Maybe, I said. Why? She smiled into her wine glass. He moved back to Denver. Then she looked up at me, waiting, watching, measuring my reaction. I smiled politely. That must be interesting. Melissa nodded. Very interesting. And in that moment, I realized something important. She was no longer hiding the existence of Mark. She was preparing me for his presence. The moment I realized Melissa was preparing for a future that did not include me was the moment I stopped preparing for a future that depended on her. That change happened quietly. There was no dramatic decision, no confrontation, no speech in front of a mirror. One day I simply woke up and understood that waiting for clarity was no longer a strategy. It was avoidance. If Melissa was building an exit in her mind, I needed to build a life that could stand on its own. October arrived with cooler temperatures and bright Colorado mornings. Leaves turned gold across the neighborhoods outside Denver. The mountains looked sharper beneath the clear autumn sky. Life continued exactly as it always had. I went to work, paid bills, attended meetings, shared dinners with my wife. On the surface, nothing changed. Underneath, everything did. I started by meeting with a financial advisor. Not because I planned to end my marriage immediately, because I needed information. Too many people ignore practical realities when emotions take control. I wanted facts, retirement accounts, property ownership, investments, long-term planning. The meeting lasted nearly 3 hours. When I left the office, I felt something I had not experienced in months. Control. Not over Melissa. Not over Mark. Over my own future. A week later, I scheduled a consultation with an attorney. Again, not because divorce was inevitable. Because uncertainty is expensive. The attorney reviewed my situation, answered questions, and explained options I hoped I would never need. As I listened, I noticed something surprising. The conversation did not make me sad. It made me calm. Knowledge has a way of reducing fear. Meanwhile, Melissa seemed happier than ever. She attended more social events, joined professional networking groups, spent increasing amounts of time messaging people whose names she rarely mentioned. Sometimes she returned home energized and distracted at the same time, like someone living in two worlds simultaneously. One evening, she walked into the kitchen smiling at her phone. When she noticed me, she locked the screen immediately. "Good day?" I asked. "Very good," she replied. Then she kissed my cheek and started talking about something unrelated. A year earlier, I would have accepted the moment without question. Now I recognized it for what it was. Deflection. Not necessarily dishonesty, but certainly distance. Around the same time, an opportunity appeared at work. My company had been exploring a partnership with a growing regional firm. The project required travel, additional responsibility, and a significant promotion if successful. Earlier in my marriage, I might have declined. Melissa often complained about business travel. She preferred predictability, stability, presence. This time I accepted immediately. The decision surprised even me. For years I had organized my life around protecting a future that now seemed increasingly imaginary. Suddenly, I found myself making choices based on my own goals instead. The effect was immediate. I felt stronger, more focused, more alive. By November, I had developed a routine. Work, fitness, financial planning, professional development. Every step moved quietly forward. I told almost no one what I was doing. There was no need. Preparation works best when it remains private. One Saturday afternoon, I visited a new townhouse development on the edge of the city. I told myself I was only curious. Yet I spent nearly 2 hours touring model homes. The experience felt strangely emotional. Not because I wanted to leave my marriage, because I was finally allowing myself to imagine life beyond it. The realization stayed with me during the drive home. Melissa greeted me cheerfully when I walked through the front door. She asked where I had been. I smiled and said I was exploring options. The answer was technically true. She laughed and assumed I meant business opportunities. I did not correct her. As Thanksgiving approached, another change occurred. For the first time since this entire situation began, I stopped thinking about Mark every day. The ghost that once dominated my thoughts gradually lost power. Not because he disappeared, because I had become occupied building something more important. Myself. Looking back, that was the moment the balance shifted. Melissa still believed she was deciding our future. She still believed she controlled the direction of our marriage. What she did not realize was that while she focused on possibilities from her past, I was quietly constructing possibilities for my future. And the farther I moved forward, the less I needed answers from either of them. December arrived carrying the familiar glow of holiday lights and year-end celebrations. By then, I had spent months quietly rebuilding parts of my life that nobody else could see. My work was thriving. The partnership project had exceeded expectations. My finances were organized. My plans were taking shape. Most importantly, I had stopped measuring my value through someone else's opinion. Melissa, however, seemed increasingly confident that everything was unfolding exactly as she expected. The distance between us continued growing, yet she never appeared concerned by it. Looking back, I think she assumed I would always be there, always waiting, always available. People become surprisingly comfortable when they believe someone else's loyalty is permanent. The event that changed everything took place at a holiday gathering hosted by one of Melissa's professional contacts. The party was held at a large home overlooking the city. White lights decorated the trees. Music drifted through the rooms. Servers carried trays of appetizers between clusters of guests discussing business, travel plans, and holiday traditions. Melissa was excited about attending. She spent nearly an hour getting ready. When we arrived, she immediately seemed energized by the crowd. For most of the evening, I stayed near a group of business owners discussing market trends and expansion opportunities. The conversations were productive, and I genuinely enjoyed them. At some point, I noticed Melissa across the room speaking with several people I did not recognize. One of them was Mark. It was the first time I had seen them together. They stood only a few feet apart, laughing at something someone had said. I expected jealousy. Instead, I felt strangely detached, almost calm. Months earlier, that sight would have ruined my evening. Now it simply confirmed what I already knew. Later, Melissa joined a larger conversation circle near the fireplace where several guests were exchanging stories about relationships, careers, and major life decisions. I was standing close enough to hear without being part of the discussion. At first, everything seemed harmless. Then someone jokingly asked how she managed to balance marriage with such an active professional life. Melissa laughed and took a sip of wine. Honestly, she said, Ryan makes things easy. Several people smiled politely. Then she continued, he is very predictable. More laughter followed. I remained still. Sometimes I think he would stay in the exact same spot for 20 years if nobody told him to move. The group laughed again. It was not cruel laughter. Just the kind people offer when they think a joke is harmless. Melissa smiled and kept going. He is dependable, though. You always need dependable people in life. Something about the way she said it bothered me. Not the words themselves. The dismissal hidden inside them. I listened as she described me the way someone might describe an appliance. Reliable. Useful. Safe. Necessary, perhaps. But never inspiring. Never important. Then one of the guests glanced toward Mark and joked that some people were more exciting than others. Melissa laughed harder than anyone. She never said anything inappropriate. She never crossed an obvious line. That was what made it worse. The disrespect hid beneath humor and implication. Plausible enough to deny. Clear enough to understand. I watched the conversation continue while Christmas music played softly in the background. Months earlier, I might have felt humiliated. Now I felt something entirely different. Clarity. Because for the first time, I realized Melissa was not just waiting for another future. She had already mentally left the current one. The marriage existed physically. Emotionally, she was somewhere else. An hour later, as guests gathered near the dining area, one of the hosts approached me. He congratulated me on the partnership project my company had recently completed. Several others joined the conversation. Questions followed. Opportunities. Future plans. The discussion grew larger until nearly a dozen people were listening. Across the room, I noticed Melissa watching. Her expression shifted slightly. Not dramatically, just enough to notice. Because many of the people speaking with me held significant influence in our industry. They knew my work. They respected my results. They saw a version of me that Melissa seemed unable to recognize. For years, she had defined me through familiarity, through routine, through assumptions. Yet standing there that night, surrounded by people discussing opportunities she knew nothing about, I saw uncertainty flicker across her face for the first time. It disappeared quickly, but I noticed it. And as we drove home beneath the glow of holiday lights, Melissa talked about the party while I listened quietly. She still believed she understood exactly who I was. What she did not realize was that the version of me she kept describing no longer existed. The envelope sat inside my briefcase for almost 3 weeks before I finally brought it home. During that time, life continued with an almost surreal sense of normalcy. Christmas came and went. Family gatherings happened. Gifts were exchanged. Photographs were taken. Melissa smiled for every camera. If anyone had looked at us from the outside, they would have seen a stable married couple moving confidently into a new year. They would have been wrong. By January, I understood something that once seemed impossible. The hardest part was no longer deciding what to do. The hardest part was accepting what had already happened. Melissa still lived in the same house. She still sat across from me at dinner. She still asked about my day and discussed weekend plans. Yet emotionally, the marriage she believed she controlled had already ended. Not because of Mark. Not because of one conversation overheard through a doorway. Because trust had quietly eroded beneath years of assumptions neither of us acknowledged. One Thursday evening, I arrived home earlier than expected. Snow covered parts of the neighborhood, and the sky darkened quickly behind low winter clouds. Inside the house, everything seemed peaceful. Melissa was in the living room responding to messages on her phone. She looked up and smiled when I walked in. "You are home early." "Meeting got canceled," I replied. She nodded and returned her attention to the screen. For a brief moment, I watched her. Not with anger. Not with resentment. Just observation. The strange thing about acceptance is that it removes urgency. I no longer needed explanations. I no longer needed confessions. The truth had already revealed itself through actions. That night, after dinner, I walked into my home office and closed the door. The envelope rested inside the top drawer of my desk. I removed it slowly and placed it on the surface in front of me. White paper. Black lettering. Months of preparation reduced to a few signatures and legal documents. I stared at it for several minutes. Then I realized something important. The envelope was not an ending. It was evidence that I had finally stopped waiting for someone else to decide my future. The following Saturday provided the moment I had been anticipating. Melissa spent most of the afternoon getting ready for a social event where Mark would also be present. She never said his name. She did not have to. I already knew. As she stood near the hallway mirror adjusting her earrings, she seemed unusually excited, hopeful, like someone approaching an opportunity she had imagined for years. Watching her felt oddly peaceful, not because I enjoyed it, because certainty had finally replaced confusion. When she returned later that evening, she appeared energized and distracted at the same time. She talked about conversations, networking opportunities, and future plans. Yet her attention seemed somewhere else. I listened quietly until she finished speaking. Then I stood and walked toward my office. "Ryan," she called after me. "Can we talk for a second?" I turned around. "Of course." She hesitated. "You seem different lately." I smiled slightly. "People change." For a moment, she looked uncomfortable, almost uncertain. Then the feeling disappeared. "I guess they do." I nodded and entered the office. A few minutes later, I returned carrying the envelope. The room was silent except for the faint sound of wind outside. Melissa looked down immediately. Her expression shifted the instant she saw it. Not fear, recognition. Somewhere deep inside, she already knew this moment was possible. I placed the envelope gently on the coffee table between us. Neither of us spoke. Finally, she looked up. "What is this?" The question sounded smaller than she intended. I sat across from her and folded my hands. "It is paperwork." Her eyes remained fixed on the envelope. The confidence I had watched for months began fading one layer at a time. "What kind of paperwork?" she asked quietly. I held her gaze for several seconds before answering. Then I said the words that changed everything. "The kind that gives both of us the future we have already been living toward." Melissa stared at the envelope as though opening it might somehow change what was inside. The room felt unusually quiet. Outside, snow drifted past the windows beneath the glow of the porch light. Inside, 7 years of assumptions sat between us on a coffee table. Finally, she reached forward and opened it. The moment she saw the documents, the color drained from her face. She looked up at me, then back down, then up again. "You are serious?" she asked softly. I nodded. "Yes." For several seconds, she simply stared. I think part of her expected this conversation to go differently. Maybe she expected hesitation. Maybe she expected negotiation. Maybe she expected the version of me she had spent years believing in. The dependable husband. The safe option. The man who would always wait. Instead, she found someone she no longer recognized. "When did you decide this?" she asked. I thought about the question. "A long time ago." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Why did you not say anything?" I almost smiled. "Because you stopped listening long before I stopped talking." The words hung in the air between us. Not cruel, not angry, just honest. Melissa looked down at the paperwork again. For the first time since I had known her, she seemed genuinely uncertain. Not about Mark, not about the marriage, about herself. The following weeks passed quietly. There were conversations, meetings with attorneys, financial discussions, practical decisions. None of it looked like the dramatic endings people imagine. Real life rarely does. Most endings arrive through paperwork, signatures, and silence. During that time, something unexpected happened. The more distance appeared between us, the more clearly I began seeing things. Not just about Melissa, about myself. For years I had measured success through stability. I believed that if I worked hard enough, sacrificed enough, and remained dependable enough, everything else would eventually fall into place. What I learned instead was that loyalty only has value when it is mutual. Spring arrived. The divorce became final. I moved into the townhouse I had visited months earlier. The promotion at work became permanent. New projects followed. New opportunities appeared. My life did not suddenly become perfect. That is not how healing works. But it became mine again. One afternoon nearly 8 months later, I ran into an old mutual friend at a business conference. During our conversation, Melissa's name came up naturally. I listened without asking many questions. Apparently things had not unfolded the way she expected. Mark had returned to Denver, but the future she imagined never materialized. The reality proved very different from the memory she had carried for years. They spent time together. then less time, then almost none at all. Eventually, he accepted a position in another state and moved again. When I heard that, I felt nothing resembling satisfaction, only perspective, because by then I understood something important. Mark was never really the story. He had simply been a symbol, an unfinished chapter Melissa spent years idealizing. The real story was what happens when people stop appreciating what is already in front of them. Several months later, I received a message from Melissa asking if we could meet for coffee. I considered declining. Instead, I agreed. We met at a small cafe near downtown on a warm September afternoon. She looked different. Not older, just quieter. Life had a way of removing certainty from all of us eventually. We talked for nearly an hour. Careers, family, ordinary things. Then she finally looked at me and asked the question I think she had been carrying for a long time. Do you ever regret it? I leaned back and considered my answer carefully. No, I said. Do you? She looked down at her coffee. For several seconds, she did not speak. Then she smiled sadly. Sometimes I think I spent too much time waiting for the life I imagined and not enough time appreciating the life I already had. I nodded. There was nothing else to add. When we stood to leave, she thanked me for meeting her. We exchanged a polite goodbye and walked in opposite directions. As I stepped outside, sunlight reflected from the glass buildings across the street. People hurried along sidewalks. Traffic moved steadily through the city. Life continued forward, exactly as it always does. And for the first time in years, I felt completely at peace. Because the greatest lesson was never about losing Melissa. It was about discovering my own value after spending too long letting someone else define it. She had spent years believing I was a substitute waiting for a better option to arrive. In the end, the truth turned out to be much simpler. While she was waiting for someone from her past, I was building a future. And by the time she finally understood the difference, I was already living it.